didn't really have the money to be competing at the top then, or potentially even change the system to pull them out completely, then that has to fall at the shoulders of, well, Derby County have a whole host of problems of their own that they're going to have to deal with over the course of the next few weeks, within not only this January transfer window, but also heading towards the back end of the season. We know that there's issues with budgets, with the squad. There's players underperforming and players that just aren't being given opportunities. And in my opinion, questions need to start being asked of those at Derby County in positions of power. Now, I'm going to start off this video by talking about the budget. We've already known since David Clowes took over that it was a short-term fix. Didn't really have the money to be competing at the top end of the Championship division, and ultimately it seems it doesn't really have the budget to be competing in that mid-table. And for me, when it comes down to the budget, it's the David Clowes problem that Paul Warne gets the blame for, because obviously when you talk about budgets, obviously the more money you have available, the more players you can look at, the further afield you can look and scout to go and see games and things like that. It all comes down to budgetary requirements, and I have seen a lot of talk about transfers, which we'll get into a little bit later on in this video, but the budget is a Clowes problem that Warne will get the blame for no matter what happens. In my opinion, I do believe that questions need to be asked of David Clowes and his input into the club for players. Now, I'm not saying that he hasn't funded the club in terms of paying the bills and bringing players in already and staff and things like that, but ultimately, we know we need more players. We need a better squad. And the only person who can help Derby County do that is David Clowes. He's got to put the money in front of Paul Warne in order to do that. As of the time of recording, we're yet to make a transfer. Despite being linked with a selection of players already, we're yet to see anyone come through the door. That could obviously change, and if it has changed, there will be a video on that on the channel, so make sure you check that out. And then we get on to the squad. Now, in my opinion, that's a joint problem between David Clowes and Paul Warne. Warne will get all the stick for it, but he's also got to deal with going back to the budgets. He's got to deal with the budget he's given on the players that he then brings in, which ultimately makes it a very hard situation for not just Paul Warne, but also for David Clowes. Warne has to deal with budgetised players, which probably aren't the players he wants, aren't of the quality he wants, whereas David Clowes has to deal with the arguments that are coming in from fans as we're speaking here right now about those funds that are coming into the club and what players they're going to end up being spent on and things like that. You've also then got to think about Clowes will get the stick based on the budget, but Warne will get the blame based on the players, and I think they're very intertwined together. We then go on to talking about players underperforming, your likes of Mendes Lang, your likes of Caden Jackson, and some other players within the squad who aren't hitting the heights that they should be hitting, aren't hitting the performance levels they should be hitting. But in my personal opinion, that is a Paul Warne problem, and a Paul Warne problem only. If he's not willing to take those players out of the squad and replace them with players who are outs with in the squad, say a Corey Blackett-Taylor or Tom Barkhuizen for those two, then, or potentially even change the system to pull them out completely, then that has to fall at the shoulders of Paul Warne, because Paul Warne is that decision maker. He makes decisions on those players. He makes decisions on the squads. He makes decisions on the first team. Now, don't get me wrong, he gets help on that from the likes of Richie Barker, the likes of Matt Hamshaw, the likes of Andy Warrington. But ultimately, Paul Warne makes the final say. And this goes into my next point, which is about not playing Corey Blackett-Taylor. Is we've seen Corey Blackett-Taylor, in my opinion, be very effective for Derby County on occasion off the bench this season, but he's never really been given a run of games this season to get into a flow where he's going to play. You could also talk about Joe Ward. Came in out of the cold to play versus Burnley, putting in what I would consider a really good performance, and then has practically been in and off the bench since. I know there's rumours about injuries and illnesses, but I think it's a load of bollocks, to be completely fair with you. I do personally think that if there is an injury, if there is illness between Corey Blackett-Taylor and Joe Ward, I don't know where they've got it from, because they're not travelling, they're not training, they're not playing. Well, they're probably training, but they're not playing, are they? And I think we can see with the likes of Joe Ward, the likes of Corey Blackett-Taylor, two players who, in my opinion, could have massive impact on what Derby County are doing, or any club in this division, they could have an impact on proceedings, but they're not being given an opportunity. And I find it really hard for a player to make a case for a starting position in the team if they're not being given that opportunity. And that's the one thing that annoys me with Corey Blackett-Taylor, the Corey Blackett-Taylor situation, and that all falls on Paul Warne. Now, we have to talk about injuries as well, because Derby County have suffered a lot of them over the course of the last few months, and there's a lot that, in my opinion, has to come down to Paul Warne, because of the training regimen and things like that. We know they're hard on the players. That's been admitted and discussed by not only Paul Warne but Richie Barker. It's been discussed by the playing staff. But they've brought in loads of new fitness staff over the course of the summer and over the course of the last few years, really. And ultimately, we're getting more injuries now than ever, and it's always to our best players. And they do have all the data. I know they do. I've seen firsthand some of the data that the club gets in terms of physical condition and things like that. And I'm not saying that Derby County aren't sort of listening to what that data is saying, but I do believe that there is going to be situations where Derby County are probably playing players who are probably in what I'd call the red zone, where they probably shouldn't be playing. And obviously, with a lack of bench options, with a lack of Paul Warne's will for rotation for the likes of Mendes, Lang and Jackson, and obviously Jerry Yates, you then get those situations where you pick up those injuries. Now, those three haven't really suffered with injuries, but when you look at a David Ozo, an innocuous muscle injury that turns into a long-term thing where he's been out for nearly, 3.5 months now. Obviously, Ryan Niambi's has nothing to do with Paul Warne. Cashin's muscle injury, I think you can link that back to training and methods like that, but obviously they can happen at any point. Injuries are a 50-50. Some are unexpected and not necessarily what you need. Some ultimately come because of other things. And in my opinion, questions need to be asked around all of these things, because David Clowes, I believe, has stated over the Christmas period that there will be funds available for Paul Warne to go and improve this squad. Now, my question is, why haven't we already been doing the research on the players we want? Now, do Derby County have a list of targets? In my opinion, yes. And this is where I want to talk about the transfers for a little bit, because Mark Thomas has seen a lot of flack over the course of the last few weeks, really, from talking about the summer transfers and heading into this January window, about what does he actually do. And what needs to be made clear for Derby County is Paul Warne has final say. Paul Warne said before Mark Thomas arrived at Derby County that he would leave the club, he would walk away if he didn't have final say on transfers. So Mark Thomas could put forward a player in our budget that could end up being the next Messi, the next Neymar, the next Ronaldo. He could put a player in our budget in front of Paul Warne. But if Paul Warne doesn't want that player, we won't sign the player. So when people are talking about the transfers and what is Mark Thomas doing, what are the recruitment team doing, everyone needs to take into consideration that that decision on who we bring in is decided by Paul Warne. I know for a fact that recruitment teams, maybe they probably pick out over the course of, say, September to November, they probably pick out 200 players, 300 players, depending on the range of their search. They will probably whittle that down to, right, what positions do we need players? And that conversation will come from a conversation with Paul Warne. What position do we need players? And let's whittle down this 200, 300 players down to a short list of, say, 3 per position or 5 per position of what we need, and then have some backups in case an injury happens or things like that. And they'll have lists. They'll have clip folders, they'll have data on the player, they'll have spreadsheets of how they rank the players from number 1 target to the bottom end target, and they will have all that. And the big thing for me when it comes to that is when you're shortlisting players and putting lists together like that is ultimately it doesn't matter who is on that list and who is whittled down to that, say, final 10 per position or whatever it ends up being. If Paul Warne doesn't want the number 1 target that the recruitment staff thinks the best, Derby County will not sign that player. And this is what I don't think people are understanding. And I find it really difficult because you look at it and you think, oh, we've got a recruitment team, we've brought in all these new scouts, we've brought in all these new recruitment analysts, we've got all these people in the building that are supposed to be helping with the data side of things, and we don't seem to be able to pick a target early doors. Now, Kenzo, Zetterstrom, they weren't early doors targets really. Yes, Paul Warne had them in mind and stuff like that, but someone's got to have picked them, right? And then they've got to go through that shortlisting process before we even go and watch before a player even goes and gets watched, before they then have a conversation with the other club and things like that. And this is where I think Derby County's problem is we're spending all this time putting these players together, and Paul Warne don't want half of them. Now, whether that's true or not, I can't exactly say for sure, but what you have to acknowledge is a lot of players have already been making moves to different clubs. We've seen Ben Radcliffe leave our academy to go and join Crawley Town. We've seen Louis Barry go back to Aston Villa. And obviously there's players moving about the division already in the Championship. As we're recording this, I think it's the 4th, 5th of January, and we're in an awful predicament where other teams are making moves quickly. Plymouth are even making moves, and we're not. And it's disappointing because we're going to end up falling into that relegation battle because we've not got what we need to move forward. And that comes because those upstairs aren't giving us the opportunity to. And someone asked me a question on Twitter of, would you trust Paul Warne to spend the cash if you've got it on players that are going to improve the squad? And my response to that was, if David Clowes doesn't trust Paul Warne to spend the cash and better the team, then Paul Warne shouldn't be the manager. And that's just my personal opinion, and you lot can all have yours down in the comments, but there's a lot for Derby County that needs to be done, and that comes from those upstairs. It comes from Paul Warne, the players on the pitch, and until they do it, there's nothing we can do. We're not going to get better without players coming in. We're not going to stay in this division without players coming in. And ultimately, I said a few weeks ago, Derby County should have gone out and got Gary Rowett or Mark Robbins to take over this squad heading into January. We've already seen with Gary Rowett, 4 games unbeaten since taking over, 3 wins and a draw, which is really, really good for Oxford. They've gone from being just on the edge of the relegation zone to now, I think they're sitting in and around mid-table, which is obviously really good for them. But you think, could Gary Rowett have done better with this Derby County squad? In my personal opinion, I'd say yes. Would Mark Robbins have done better? Again, in my personal opinion, I would say yes. And this is where my problems arise, because sometimes you have to make a call that maybe isn't popular within the club straight away for the betterment of the club. I do believe that Paul Warne's job will become a business decision. If he is still in charge come May, I will be very, very surprised if he ends up being our manager for the start of next season. Because ultimately, the first thing that I think would happen, if we got someone to take over the club tomorrow, I think the first thing that would happen is Paul Warne would be relieved of his duties. That would be my personal opinion. I think a new manager would come in. A lot would be shaken up because that's what Derby County needs. Yes, we need stability. Yes, we need all of that kind of thing that goes with it. But to have that, you've also got to have confidence in your stability in the division. And in my opinion, we don't have that, which is why every time Derby County lose, there's an absolute shitstorm over social media. There's a shitstorm in the stands. There's a shitstorm over BBC Radio Derby and things like that, because ultimately we all know Paul Warne isn't going to get sacked. We know that's not going to happen. Realistically, Paul Warne would have to walk away. That's my personal opinion, and that's what I think will happen at the end of the season if Derby County stay in the division. I do believe Paul Warne will walk away. But it's one of those for me where we've got to make decisions that might be unpopular but will better the club. And that is what will happen under investment. And that's why we need someone new to come in and take over the helm. I believe that it's that it's personal for David Clowes getting rid of Paul Warne. He got rid of Liam Rosenior. He never gave Liam Rosenior the manager's job to start off with, which I thought was a joke to begin with. He's currently managing, I believe, in France. I could be wrong. I'm sure it's in France. And in my opinion, he'd have got us promoted. whether it had been the first season or the second season, whatever, he would have got us promoted. And I believe he'd have us playing better football right now, which some people may question, some people may disagree with. But that is just my personal opinion. And obviously, you lot can have your say down in the comments. If you haven't done so already, make sure you hit that subscribe button down below and turn on that notification bell to stay tuned for all of my latest Derby County content. I don't know. There's so much to say, but there's not a lot that goes with it. And yeah, that's it really. We've got problems that need solving, and David Clowes is the only one that can make those decisions, or an investor that's got to come in quickly. So yeah, I will catch you in my next video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments, hit the subscribe button, and I'll catch you in the next one.